me to be with you. And we're going to look at issues. I always like to start with stories. What you're creating here in the county is an infrastructure. One of the most interesting stories, I think, that came out of World War II was one of the reasons why the Allies beat the Nazis. And it had to do with an infrastructure of supply. I was in France, went to Normandy, and the guide talked to us about how actually the Allies won because they figured out an infrastructure for getting supplies to the troops, and the Nazis didn't. And one of the reasons when Eisenhower came back as President of the United States, one of the first things he did was he set up the interstate system for the United States because he understood it was an infrastructure that was going to be critical for our future. You're doing the same thing in your county, but it's a different kind of infrastructure. And that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about, as we live in a knowledge-based economy now, how communities interact is very different because we have internet, we have all the other kinds of ways of communicating. A lot of the institutions that we used to develop human capacity are only quasi-functional now. So what we're looking at is how communities begin to create infrastructures that allow them to thrive. There's a guy out of California, his name is Paul Sappho, and he says a couple things. He runs the Institute for the Human Future, and he says this: 20 years from now, communities will either be feral, i.e. they were domesticated and went back to the wild, or they'll be thriving. And he also says this: it takes 20 to 25 years to become an overnight success, okay? So let me say, when you create infrastructures, they don't develop overnight. As I know you're well aware, on the little journey between here and Bloomington, that infrastructure is taking some time, okay? And so what we're looking at is how you begin to do this as it relates to the resources. And I like to start with a story, another story. See, one of the things that happens when you grow up is that your early memories are stored in your amygdala, which is a fascinating part of your brain. And it has a long-term memory for the feeling, but a short-term memory for the incident. So what happens is you act on the feeling even though you don't know why. How many of you in this room have done something and you looked at yourself later and said, oh no, that was my mother again, that was my father again? Has that happened to you? Yeah, well, your amygdala kicked in, okay? And what happens is we carry that understandings with us as we go through life. And they shape our behavior, they shape our thinking, and more importantly, they shape communities. I know I was working in Waco, Texas, and this woman came up to me at break. It was a community meeting, and she said, Ruby, we are so angry. I said, what is it? She said, well, we had this young lady coming to us from the community college, and she was coming to our Wednesday morning prayer meeting. We just loved her, but she always came on the city bus. So we all got together, put our money together, and we bought her a used car. 2 weeks later, when she came, she was on the city bus again. And we asked her what happened to the car. And she said, well, she sold the car and bought her boyfriend a motorcycle. I said, you know, if I was the young lady, I would have done the same thing too. And she said, you can't be serious. I said, I am. That young lady knew two things about her reality, and she knew she couldn't keep the car. Take a minute and talk with your neighbor. What are the two things the young lady knew about her reality? Why couldn't she keep the car? Tell your neighbor, why couldn't she keep the car? Why didn't she keep the car? Well, what kind of resources does a car take? Talk to your neighbor. What else? You know, it's like a child that needs shoes, it needs food, you know, it needs everything, okay? The second thing about it is that she knew this, that one of the hidden rules in survival neighborhoods is that if somebody asks you for something, you have to share. And she knew it was just a matter of time till somebody asked to borrow that car and she had to say yes. She knew the consequences of that would be more disastrous, so it was easier to sell the car. That's what we're going to look at. how your realities shape your thinking. And I want to say very briefly, for those of you who have not heard me speak before, how many of you have not heard me speak before? All right. One of the things that's bothering you right now is this accent, okay? Because, you know, you're wondering where it came from. And the other problem is if you're in Indiana and anybody has a southern accent, there's a strong belief they cannot be that bright either. Okay, so that's bothering a bunch of you too. All right, so take a minute, talk with your neighbor. Tell your neighbor where you think that it came from, and then I'll explain, and then we'll be okay. So tell your neighbor. Well, if I don't answer this, it'll bother you, all right? So let me explain. Okay, I was born in Indiana, Elkhart, Indiana. Yes, ma'am. And then I lived in Ohio, then I lived in Virginia, and then I lived in Indiana. I lived in Haiti, down in the Caribbean, for 3.5 months. Then I lived in Indiana. Then I lived in Corpus Christi, Texas. Then Chicago, Illinois. You know, they only have 2 seasons up there, winter and the 4th of July. Yeah. Then I lived in Houston. Now I live in Corpus Christi. Moved back and forth between the South and the Midwest. And when I first started speaking, people would say, you talk too fast and you need to enunciate more clearly. So I've worked really hard on that, and now people think I'm Cajun. So I don't want to. The second thing I need to explain is very briefly, just a little bit about how this work got started, so you know, in case you care. But I grew up Mennonite, okay? I know you know what Mennonites are in Indiana. And some people confuse them with the Amish. No, I did not grow up in a buggy, okay? But I did get kicked out. You know that little white hat they wear, that means you're obedient. That was a problem, okay? Anyway, I was married for many years to my former husband, Frank Payne, who died in 2010, and he grew up in extreme poverty, and we lived right next to his neighborhood for many years in Goshen, Indiana. And I had never seen people live that way. And I saw them doing a lot of things in the neighborhood that I'd seen in Haiti. And I didn't understand hidden rules. And so one of the things we're going to talk briefly about is this whole construct of hidden rules. Because what hidden rules do is they keep communities from working together. You see, hidden rules are unspoken cueing mechanisms people use to know you do or don't belong. And the way you know you broke a hidden rule is the way people look at you, okay? How many of you have been in a social setting that was so uncomfortable you could not wait to leave? Okay? How many of you have been in a new church and stood up at the wrong time? Okay, well, there you go. Okay, so the bottom line on the thing, I learned the hidden rules of his neighborhood, and I didn't think anything about it. And then he took a job in the Chicago Board of Trade. We were thrown in with very wealthy people, and I didn't know the hidden rules of wealth. And I had people looking at me again like, how does that child know how to come in out of the rain, okay? So I learned the hidden rules, and then I wouldn't have done anything with it, but we had a school. I was an educator for many years. We had a school that was having a lot of difficulty. The principal came to me and basically said the following. She said, we've got 800 students and 900 discipline referrals. And she said, if I have another year like this, I won't make it. So I said, tell me your data. She said, the data doesn't help. I said, tell me a story. So this is a story that started the whole thing. And that's why the book got written. But she said, I got 2 sets of twins in the building. They got 2 sets of clothes. They wear one set one day, one set the next. She said, so I asked them if I could give them money for the holidays. The mother said yes. I gave them $200 for clothes. The girls came back for the holidays with the same clothes. She said, I called one of the little girls and asked them what happened. And they said, well, we bought a DVD player. I said, if I was the mother, I would have done the same thing. She said, I told her poverty is painful, and a priority for your money is entertainment. It takes away the pain. She said, but they needed those clothes. I said, did they ask you for them? She said, no. So I told her this next story. She was having so much difficulty. I'm going to tell you the same story, and I'm going to ask you the same question I asked her. I was in this woman's home on the North Shore of Chicago, and the woman had an income of about $6 million a year, but the woman is quite bitter because she believes she's poor. She doesn't have a yacht. That's what she was upset about. Not too long ago, I read this article in a magazine. It said if you want to understand sailing or yachting or boating, all you have to do is stand in a cold shower and tear up $100 bills. And you got the concept, okay? Well, this woman had an income of, she had an artwork, she had a Picasso actually on her wall. It was, I found out later, it was a $1.4 million Picasso. And I said to this principal, I said, listen, she had a $1.4 million Picasso. I said, if she would give that to you, what would you do with it? Talk to your neighbor. If somebody gave you a $1.4 million Picasso, what would you do with it? Most people would do what? Yeah. They'd sell it before they hung it up, you know, because they'd be thinking, you know, I lived this long without a Picasso, I bet I can live some more, okay? And I said, that's what those girls were thinking about their clothes. So one thing led to another, and I wrote the book. So part of the reality is this. When you start looking at this, one of the things you understand is that one of the reasons America has never really been actually able to solve the issue around class, and Western countries haven't, is because there's no agreement on causation. What causes it? When Pastor Rick said there are a lot of different causes, it's correct. What has happened is there are 4 separate research bases about what causes class. And they see all disciplines move from naming something, classification, to saying how it works with other things, correlation, to causation, what causes it. Well, there are 4 separate research bases, and they've all well researched, and they've been politicized. So communities fight about causation. The first cause is behaviors of the individual. The second one is jobs. Basically, you can make all the right personal choices, but if there's no jobs, you're in trouble. The third one is exploitation, racism, sexism, predators. If you get an advance on a paycheck from a payday lender, talk to your neighbor just a minute. What % of interest did you end up paying? An advance on your check. It's anywhere from 150 to 400%. And the last one is political and economic systems. Many people don't know that in the 80s, we started giving Social Security numbers to children when they were born. In some households that are severely stressed, the parents will use the child's Social Security number to get the electricity turned back on. By the time the child turns 18, their credit rating is ruined. Most employers right now will not hire an individual without doing a credit check or criminal check on them. And a lot of employers, if they have a bad credit rating, won't hire them. It's a political and economic systemic thing. Now, if you're on the political right, you think it's about the first 2 research bases. You think it's about jobs and individual choices. If you're on the political left, you think it's about exploitation, sexism, racism, and systemic issues. When we work with a community, it's about all of them. All of them are there at the table, all of them created. And when we work with communities, we say, hey, if you're only going to use one of them, you're not going to make any progress. You have to really look at the total issue of how it happens. Well, what happens now in communities is this. There are 2 sides to economic development. One is jobs and that kind of bringing in, but the flip side of the coin is the human capacity to take the job. And what we've done is we've only looked at one side of it, and it's become complicated for communities. And part of this infrastructure we're talking about is this. When we were primarily agrarian, you didn't have to go to school to make a living. And the way we represented wealth on paper was something we called a deed. There's a wonderful book by a guy out of a think tank in Peru called Why Capitalism Thrives in the West and Fails Everywhere Else. But basically what he says is we use these representational pieces of paper to create wealth. You can't take your whole property into the bank, you can take that piece of paper. When we became industrial, we took that same concept across. But the way we represented wealth on paper was something we called a stock certificate. Well, now we're in an intellectual capital era, or in other words, a knowledge-based economy where people make money out of their heads. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, etc. And nobody, I mean nobody, knows how you represent intellectual capital on paper. How do you represent talent? Is it patents? Is it copyrights? The closest we have to it is whether or not you have a college degree. But everybody in this room every day works with people who have a college degree and they don't have any intellectual capital. You know, it's a problem, okay? So the bottom line is, we don't really know how you represent it. Well, now, knowledge has become a form of privilege. And how you spend your time impacts your knowledge base. And we define poverty as a set of resources, 9 resources, because any one of those resources, not having them, can destabilize your environment. Right now in America, we only talk about money as being a destabilizer, but mental illness is a destabilizer. There are all kinds of destabilizers, and we're going to define middle class as when your resource base is stable. I've done work all over the world. In fact, I'm going to India on Sunday. I don't care where you are in the world. The more resourced you are, the more you live on the right-hand side of that chart. The less resourced you are, the more you live on the left-hand side of the chart. It's just a reality. And the closer you get to survival, I don't care who you are in the world, the more you live on the left-hand side of the chart. You live in instability and crisis. Talk to your neighbor just a minute. Why would it be true? The fewer your resources, the more unstable your environment becomes. Take a minute and talk with your neighbor. Why is that true? Well, it's pretty obvious, I think. You can't ever predict what's going to happen to you. And then it gets further complicated by this. The more unstable your environment becomes, the more difficult it becomes to plan. It's almost impossible to plan. Yet to function in school or to function in work, you have to be able to plan. One of the things that happens is over time, people don't seek options anymore. Patrick Moynihan said it best in the 1960s. He said, you know, the Russians will never catch up with the Americans. He said, because if you're not allowed to question your government and then you're not allowed to question your religion, pretty soon you don't question anything. You see, when you're a survival environment, everything's about either or. If I go to the grocery store with $2, I can buy this or I can buy this, but I can't have them both. And so over time, you don't seek options anymore. You don't even know them. One of the huge issues I'm so concerned about is what happens to men in survival environments. There's a brilliant African-American sociologist out of Harvard. His last name is Wilson, and he says this: if you want to break a culture, all you have to do is take work away from men, because it changes identity. Because you no longer have an identity as a provider. And so you eventually, your identity, the 2 identities in generational poverty that are most admired are men who are physical fighters because they provide protection, and men who are lovers. Frank, my former husband, died in 2010. His brother Jim died in 2011 in jail. And Jim was a fighter and a lover all his life. In fact, he used to tell me, you know, when he was running from the law, you know, when you're a fighter and a lover, you spend a lot of time running from the law, okay? And he used to tell me, you know, well, Ruby, I go to the local bar, he said, because you know everybody gets prettier at closing time. Okay, I get it, okay? You're looking for a place to stay. But the bottom line is this: what happens now is that knowledge now is a form of privilege because people make a living from knowledge. And how you spend your time determines your knowledge base. One of the things we do with Getting Ahead is that when we work with adults who are at survival, we ask them to identify how they spend their time, because how you spend your time determines your knowledge base. One of the things that's the same around the world is that everybody only has 24 hours a day, period. That's it. And how you spend your time really impacts what you know. And this is what a compilation of 300 adults in survival environments say they spend their time on. in the United States. Take a minute and talk to your neighbor. What do you see on this chart that would not be on your own chart? Talk with your neighbor. It's okay to talk. It's good for your brain. What's agency time? Time to go to agencies for help, okay? The next circle is what people in stable environments say they spend their time on, okay? Middle class, if you will, or stable environments when they know their resources are predictable. Take a minute, talk with your neighbor. What do you see on this chart you did not see on the first chart?
Vacation.
And this last chart is what people in wealth, new and old money, say they spend their time on. Take a minute and talk with your neighbor. What do you see on this chart you did not see on the other chart?
Yeah.
Every day won't do. Just proved I'm not rich.
All right, my question for you is this. Is one chart better than another? No, they're just different. I had a congressman say to me, there's no difference between relationships and connections. See, whatever's in the middle of that chart stabilizes that reality. And I said, there's a huge difference between relationships and connections. Relationships help you get by, but connections help you what? Get ahead. Very different reality. And these realities then create their own hidden rules. And I just want to spend a little bit of time with you with hidden rules before we go, because they impact communities. The reason hidden rules become so important is they break relationships. And furthermore, people equate them with intelligence. And so I want to talk about them, and I want to give you a few hidden rules that seem to be the same around the world. Okay? One of them is appearance. You get 3 minutes in a job interview, people made a decision about you based upon your appearance. 70 to 80% of teacher expectation is basically based upon student appearance. You looked at me when you walked in here, and a lot of you knew within 3 minutes I was middle class, okay? In fact, a couple of you said, what would a white middle class woman know about poverty, okay? You knew just by looking. Well, we have hidden rules about food. If you've noticed, if you have food at an event, you get more people to come, okay? Food, yep, you're here. Okay, food and poverty are very important, because food is the line between being destitute and being poor. People say we're poor growing up, but we always had enough to eat, okay? And the issue around food and poverty is quantity. And the question after the meal is, are you full? Did you have enough, okay? In middle class, food is about quality. And people say, well, did you like it? Was it good? See, the diet in poverty is very high in carbohydrates and fats. And one of the reasons is carbohydrates and fats help your brain make serotonin, and serotonin keeps you from being depressed, okay? That's why if you're on that paleo diet for more than a week, you thought you're going to kill somebody. Your brain isn't making any serotonin, okay? But in wealthy issues around presentation, was it artistically presented? Did it have aesthetic appeal? Did it go with the theme, okay? How many of you have been out to eat, spent $30 on the entree, you got this much food? Then as you were leaving your dinner party, and somebody at your dinner party said, now let's go get real food, okay? You had to go by the Golden Corral, okay? Well, these hidden rules carry across, and people get offended. The one that people find most offensive is the one about time and money. And it just disrupts communities. Because people say, I'm not going to give to them because look what they did. Or I'm not going to do that because of this. It has to do with hidden rules around time and money. And I don't care where you are in the world. If you want to keep your environment stable, there's certain things you do with your time and your money. If you want to keep your environment stable, what people in middle class or stable environments do, if you will, is they spend their time and money around 3 things. Work, achievement, they go to school, and they work to create material security. In other words, they buy things that turn into an asset, like a mortgage. And they have 4 rules about money. Number one, I don't ask you for money, and what?
We don't ask me.
Number two, if you borrow, you gotta what?
Pay it back.
Number three, you never ever quit a job until?
You have one to go to.
And number four, do you tell people your salary?
No.
No. You know the rules. But if you're in wealth, and you've been there 2 generations or more, you have a real problem. And there's such reverse snobbery in middle class about wealth. Because middle class doesn't understand what a huge issue personal safety is in wealth. You have a big problem, and your problem is this. You have more resources than you can take care of yourself personally. And you have to hire people to help you. It makes you very vulnerable at a personal safety level. You can be robbed, you can be kidnapped. And so in wealth, your decision making is made against your financial, your social, and your political connections for 2 reasons. Number one, they keep you safe. Number two, they help you make more money. Which leads to another hidden rule. When you go to a party among the truly wealthy, you never introduce yourself. Anybody know what happens if you do? They'll turn around and walk off. You won't be acknowledged. But if you go to a party among the middle class and you don't introduce yourself, what are you?
A snob.
Well, let me explain to you. If you're wealthy, you do the same thing. Let's suppose we're at a party, because these rules help you survive environments. Let's suppose we're at a party. You're wealthy and I'm not. I come up and I introduce myself to one of you. You know what you're thinking? Who is she and what does she want? If she were anybody at all, I'd have been introduced to her. And when you are introduced, they say your name and your connection. So-and-so was such and such a firm or family. They say, this Ruby, she's my very dear friend. You know what that means? I like her, but she's got no connections, okay? Yeah. I have been introduced that way, okay? I have. And what's the rule about money? You just don't talk about the cost of an item. But if you were in poverty, if you're in survival, and you've been there 2 generations or more, you have a different problem again. Your problem this time is you don't have material security. My brother and I made the slide from stability to extreme instability in 10 years. It didn't take him 2 generations. He was farming in the 1980s. It was a brutal time to farm. He lost his farm. During that time, he and his wife had a severely handicapped child. The child is 21 right now and can't feed himself, so that knocked the wagering around the household. Then my brother got sick, but he didn't go to the doctor for a long time, and now he's got a degenerative illness that's so advanced he cannot work. And last year, a year and a half ago, he got cancer, so he's in the process of dying. So what I do is I pay, I bought the house they live in, I pay for that. I give him cash each month, several $100s. I have a sister who gives him cash. I have a brother who pays their utilities. I have another sister who gives him cash. I mean, we all got together and bought him a vehicle. But he doesn't make his decisions against work and achievement and material security. He makes his decision against survival, relationships, and entertainment. People keep him alive, not work. And when people become your possession, all the rules change. That's why there's a disproportionate amount of domestic violence and poverty, because they're yours. That's why in generational poverty, parents fear their children getting too educated. Because when children get too educated, what do? They leave. In poor white neighborhoods, they say you're getting above your raisins, you're too big for your britches. In poor African-American neighborhoods, they call them Oreos. Poor Hispanic neighborhoods, coconuts. Poor Asian neighborhoods, bananas. Poor Native American Indian neighborhoods, they call them apples. But the issue is still the same. We're afraid we're going to lose you. Situational poverty will encourage, working poverty will encourage their children to be educated. But generational poverty is often equated with loss. And the reason is middle class worries when they get old, they won't have financial security. But what you worry about when you're old in generational poverty is that you won't have physical safety, and you want your children with you. And what's the rule about money in poverty? If you have any, and I ask you for some, you have to share. It's how we're going to stay alive. Huge article in Wall Street Journal 3 years ago about all the big box stores, Target, Walmart, etc., at midnight of the night when people get their electronic food stamps to their cards. They're jammed with people. They have to have extra stockers and extra cashiers, and they couldn't understand why. I do. Number one, you're probably hungry. And number two, if you don't use everything on the card that night, somebody's going to call you in the morning and say, hey, I know you just got paid. You got your food stamps. Can I borrow it? And you have to say yes. People go, I don't know why you have to borrow it. Pretty easy. Middle class, your car breaks down on the highway, you call AAA. Generational poverty, your car breaks down on the highway, you call Uncle Ray, okay? And if Uncle Ray asked to borrow your food card and you said no, what's he going to say when you ask him to help you with your car? No. So what happens in communities is this, and one of the reasons I'm so excited is that as we move into what you're doing here, as we move into an intellectual capital era, it's going to require a different kind of infrastructures for communities to stay alive and thrive. And what's happening is that you are building, not only have you built in this area an infrastructure for getting by, but you are in the process of building an infrastructure for getting ahead. There is a brilliant African-American historical demographer. He writes for Forbes magazine. His last name is Sowell, Thomas Sowell, S-O-W-E-L-L. And he says this, when any community allows any segment of that community to be disenfranchised, the whole community becomes poorer economically. And what happens is, to create a thriving community now, in an intellectual capital era, requires a different kind of infrastructure. And you as a community are on the forefront of communities in America who are actually working on this. And as you know, infrastructures do not develop overnight. Again, may I call attention to State Highway 37, okay, which I spent a great deal of time on yesterday, okay? And the bottom line is this. I commend you for what you're doing because you're creating a prototype, a community infrastructure that many communities don't even know they need yet. And it's amazing. So it's been a pleasure for me